In the beginning, God sent His light into the world. That light was Jesus, and He gave life to men and women. The light dispelled darkness everywhere it was lit. Whether the darkness manifested itself in sickness, in demonization, in isolation, in sin, or even in death, the light brought healing, freedom, community, in right living, and in life. When Jesus ascended into heaven, the light did not leave the planet. He made sure His light remained in each person who trusted Him. The light lived in them and spread as they passed on His radiance to those they met. For centuries, pockets of illumination were established in villages and towns around the world. Lancaster was no different. Like lamps spread throughout the city, these communities of light gather in buildings on street corners, homes, and even in barns. With so many lamps already in the city, why was one more needed? This is the story of how God called Joel and Christy Seymour to move back to Lancaster in order to light another lamp. It's not the only light in town, nor even the best, but God wanted it lit.
So people ask us all the time, like, how did this whole thing get started 20 years ago? Why did we even move here to plant the Lancaster Vineyard? You remember those days back then? That's a long time ago. It all started really with some simple prayers. November of '96, I went to a conference in Columbus and drove back to Northwest Ohio and shared with Christy just about praying about what God would have for us next. And we really thought that meant staying in Northwest Ohio doing some stuff. But as we prayed, just a few months into that prayer, I really started getting a heart for Lancaster again. I grew up in Canal Winchester, and Christy grew up in Sugar Grove. But a lot of our formative years and teenage years were spent mainly in Lancaster. And so we just kept praying about it, and it took a while for us to be convinced. We were wondering, was this just our thoughts or God? But over time we realized this is exactly where God wanted us.
I know it was a really long process of planning this church, just lots of confirmation over, I don't know how long of a time period.
From November to '96 to really, it wasn't till June or July of '97, so a good 8 or 9 months it took us to really decide.
Yeah, so it wasn't a quick thing, and it wasn't an easy thing either. It was really hard. We were at a church that was thriving and doing well, that we were called to, and even though I love the thought of being back home with family and all that, we had kind of established our life there with our first house, and great church, great friends, and I just didn't quite understand why God would pull us away from that, because things were going so well and we were seeing lives changed and people coming to know the Lord for the first time. And so I have to be honest and say I was kind of upset with God for a while. Like why take us away from that? There's plenty of churches in Lancaster. Why us? Why do we have to leave what we're doing? And so at that conference, I don't know if it was a ministry time. I don't know when it was, but I remember the Lord clearly speaking to me and saying that, all the lost people that you look at your church at Oasis, which was the church we were at, when you look around and see those people, and it gets you excited that's that you've changed their lives because of us being there. He spoke to me clearly and just said, there's a lot of people like that in Lancaster that will never know me if you don't go. And so when I heard him say those words, I was like, wow, this is what we need to do.
But we just started praying, whatever you want, God, we want to be a part of. And then in early '97, I was at Columbus Vineyard, and I saw their small group wall, and there must have been 120 small groups back then. And there was a card for Lancaster. And it hit my heart. I got chills when I saw it. wow, there's a vineyard, like people who believe in naturally supernatural lifestyles, that believe in the kingdom of God is here, that you can reach out and grab it and see people healed and saved and delivered and do contemporary worship and grow close to God and experience His presence. Like there's a little group in Lancaster doing something with a small group, and that hit my heart. And as we just kept praying about what we were supposed to do, we kept being drawn to back to Lancaster and to the vineyard and to plant a vineyard. It peaked really May and June of 1997. Jay and Amy Schumacher, who are part of the life of this church and helped us start the church, well, before any of this happened, they were getting married, and I was doing the wedding ceremony. We were back for Memorial Day weekend of 97, and we stayed up late playing cards, and that night, a friend of mine, Greg, and I stayed up to about 3, and I was just sharing with him my heart that I thought I was supposed to move back and that we were supposed to plant a vineyard here in Lancaster. And I told him, I said, I just wish God would tell me clearly, because I'm afraid if I move, I'll screw something up in Northwest Ohio. If I don't move, then I'll screw something up that He wants to do in Lancaster. And I wish somebody tomorrow would come up to me and just tell me I'm supposed to plant a church. And when you know it, a boss of mine who I'd worked for in high school and college, who'd always been good to me, Gary Johnson. In fact, his wife Barb's a part of our church now here at the Vineyard. Gary came up to me during the reception at that wedding and said, Joel, I don't know if you believe that God still speaks clearly like this, but I've been praying for you, and I've just sensed you're supposed to plant a church and be the senior pastor. Does that mean anything to you? I'm like, wow, does it ever? We had another experience like that a month later where Christy and I were at a worship training. I would go to Toronto 5 hours away to get training once a month to be a worship leader. And at that training, Christy was with me that month. It was the only month she got to go to that. And Dan Wilt, who now heads up Vineyard's media and digital production for the movement, Vineyard USA, Dan came up to us and just said, man, I've been praying for you. Trying to make a big decision about ministry? And we looked at each other, and I said, well, yeah, what do you see? And he goes, I see a collage with lots of different pictures, and it's the Lord saying, don't be afraid of change in ministry, that changes will happen in ministry, and God's going to give you lots of ministry experiences. And we laughed and cried the whole way home, because we were excited that God's call was clear, that we knew what He wanted us to do. We cried too, because it meant leaving friends, to move. And we won't lie, we were scared. I mean, we were, when we planted this thing, we were 26 and we didn't know what we were doing. But God called us, so we came. We just really developed even more of a heart for the city, and we would use words like building a church for unchurched folks, or I remember, I don't know if you remember, we used the word disenfranchised a lot, like just people that felt disenfranchised, not only from the church, but just people or community or wholeness, that they needed connected to something bigger than themselves. And what we knew is they needed connected to Jesus. And so we decided to move here to plant a church like that. We felt like we were called to see people's lives change, and it's not a Joel or Christy story. We just happen to be the people who were initially called to do this thing. But there's lots and lots of people who joined us, from Jay and Amy to those first small groups to all of you who are watching this that are part of the Lancaster Vineyard family. We're all in this together. It's all of us have been called to be workers in the harvest field. And it's not even just about the vineyard. We're just one more light in this city, because there's a lot of good churches in the city, and together we're trying to transform a city and see lots of people come to know Jesus and bring the kingdom of God to their lives. God has had us on an adventure for over 20 years, shining His light and loving Lancaster. Whether it was from our very beginning at East Walnut Street House, doing a Bible study in a small group, doing outreaches throughout the town, meeting at the YMCA for 8 years, spreading His light and His love through food pantries and small groups throughout the county, or various outreach events. We've been loving Lancaster and loving God for 20 years. We can't wait to see what's in store for the next 20.